All right, welcome everybody to our March meeting of the Knoxville Music Teachers Association. I'm very excited to see some of you here and to present our guest speaker today, Dr. Gregory Partain. It was my great pleasure to host Greg Partain last night at the University of the Cumberlands, where he gave a master class to some of our piano students and gave an incredible recital. It was so good. Do go on.
He's been going on.
I've already been blazing you on that. It was fantastic. Greg Partain is one of the most active people that I've been aware of, being a dual member of Tennessee and Kentucky music teachers. I have seen his name all over the place. He's a very frequent performer and has done many workshops and many presentations. And so we're super fortunate to have him here today. I hope you all will join me in giving a big, nice welcome to Greg Partain.
I'm really happy to have this opportunity, even though there aren't too many people here. This is a topic that is so dear to my heart. How many people here know of Konstantin Stanisklavski, the great Russian theater director? Okay. In fact, Karen, when you were at Transylvania, did we talk about him a little bit? Okay, because I remember that was the first time that I really put together some kind of presentation like this, and I'm circling back to that now after all these years. But let me tell you about him a little bit. He's the father. Uh-oh. My slideshow is not advancing. Now, how bizarre is that? I guess we're just going to be stuck on page 1. There we go. Okay, so he's the father of what we call method acting. And really for over a century, his approach, his theory of acting, along with offshoots, has been the most compelling, thorough theory of acting around. And you could say that the method really informs a lot, if not most, of the really fine acting that we see on screen and on stage. And he brought a new paradigm to acting. In essence, he taught actors how to stimulate their imaginations and how to analyze their roles in order to actually live their characters' emotions rather than just pretend to feel those emotions. And all of this is with the aim of producing performances of greater emotional depth and power. There's a quote on your handout. Did you get a handout, Karen? No, it's on top of the piano. The first quote, called "On Living Apart," and Stanisklavski wrote, "The fundamental aim of our art is the creation of the life of the human spirit and its expression in artistic form. That is why we begin by thinking about the inner side of the world and how to create its spiritual life through the internal process of living apart. It is only when an actor feels that his inner and outer life on the stage is flowing naturally and normally that the deeper sources of his subconscious gently open, and from them come feelings." So I first came across Stanisklavski when I was in my 20s in graduate school, and I read, I'm behind the curve here already, but anyway, I read this book, this classic first text, An Actor Prepares, written in 1936. And I realized that even though he was speaking to actors directly, he was also speaking to me, a teacher and a performer preparing music for performance. And with some very simple translation from theater talk to music talk, I realized he was addressing a lot of the central challenges that we face as performers and as teachers. So I'm going to introduce you to several of the core elements in his method, 8 of them specifically that have been especially meaningful to me. And we really don't have time to go into depth in any of them, but I'm hoping at least to just whet your appetite. So let's start out by looking at some of the parallels between music and acting, because there are so many. And we might as well start with the loftiest parallel. This is the second quote on your handout. He writes, "One of the human being's principal feelings is a longing for beauty, life-giving beauty, that quality which ennobles and enlivens everything it touches. We seek the beautiful and the creative in art. Beautiful in that it uplifts the life of a human being on the stage and in the audience. And creative in the sense that it produces the true life of the human spirit, without which there can be no art. I can't tell if we're talking about acting or music with that, so there he is. So, some specific parallels. Like music, theater is performance-based, and actors work from the script, musicians work from the score. Just as the actor uses the playwright's words to express thoughts, emotions, as if they were the actor's own, the musicians communicate thoughts and emotions by borrowing the composer's notes. To breathe life into the roles, actors work to develop a deep understanding of their characters. And likewise, in their profession, they develop a role. That's the term they use, they develop a role. And likewise, we players and singers are developing our interpretation. Like actors, musicians must be artistically on in the very moment that curtain rises. And actors and musicians, likewise, rehearse long hours, memorizing, practicing, perfecting, and yet we're expected to be inspired and spontaneous on stage, or as Stephen said. One of my favorite Stanisklavski quotes, and this is the third one on your handout, on practicing. Practice to make that which is difficult easy, what is easy automatic, and what is automatic beautiful. And I think many of our students are still kind of stuck in the first part. and they think once they get past that they got it. But there's more. So given these parallels and others, it's really easy, as I said, to adapt his major insights on acting to the musician's craft. And today I'm going to move back and forth pretty freely between theater speak and musician speak. There's that quote. Okay, so Stanisklavski started his career as an actor, and then he became, by his account, an autocratic director who treated his actors like mannequins. He says, I showed the actors what I saw in my imagination, and they copied me. And I think that sounds like a lot of our teaching, what our teaching is like. So his approach started to change, though, as he reflected on the methods of great actors, and also as he reflected on his own successes and failures as an actor. But one actor that he centered on especially is the Italian genius Salvini. And he realized that Stanisklavski himself possessed many of the same qualities that Salvini possessed, but he couldn't count on his best qualities to appear when needed. And he couldn't recreate inspiration on stage, whereas Salvini did, night after night. The longer that Stanisklavski played his roles, the more they degenerated, as he puts it, into stagnation and mechanical habits, whereas Salvini's roles remained creative and inspired and actually seemed to improve over time. So at age 35, Stanisklavski kind of burned out as an actor, realizing he was acting by rote and always stuck in what he called the theatrical state of mind. And he defines it this way. He says that the theatrical state of mind is that state of mind on the stage when a man has to show outwardly what he does not feel inwardly. Where the actor's mind is preoccupied with his private worries, while his body is forced to express the most lofty impulses of heroic feeling and passion. I'm still quoting, under the pressure of an audience, the performer feels hampered and crippled by fright, embarrassment, self-consciousness, perhaps by a sense of overwhelming responsibility. And he deemed the theatrical state of mind the greatest obstacle to true acting because, and again I'm quoting, at that moment the actor becomes utterly incapable of doing anything in an ordinary human way, speaking, listening, thinking, feeling, moving, breathing. Now I'm sure none of us have ever felt that. We've never had that feeling that no matter how well we know the music, we're sitting there on stage, if you're a pianist, your fingers turn mush, everything's up, and I'm sure we've never felt that, but lots of people have. So Stanisklavski began searching for a different state of mind, a creative state of mind that would be different mentally, physically, and spiritually. And he sought a state of flow that would spark inspiration, where he could be free, responsive, alert, focused, emotionally involved, spontaneous, inspired, and yet still controlled. And he called this the inner creative state. And that, of course, is the goal of this method. So he went on to explain that an actor's style of acting largely revolves around what their state of mind is in performance, but also their state of mind during rehearsal. So he talked about, he distinguished between three different types of acting. These very broad categories. Cliche acting, representation acting, and creative or truthful acting. And these follow along a continuum, with imitation of feelings being what you're not after, and experience of feelings being what we're after. So let's take a little bit of a dive into each of these, starting with the lowest form of acting, cliche acting, which he also called mechanical acting. And he said this type of actor uses a limited number of formulas to every single role. And this type of actor shows a one-dimensional understanding of the character they're playing and none of the emotions of that character. The actor doesn't become the character, but they pretend to be the character through external signs. And often, he said, the cliche actor, this manifests as ham acting or high-tension acting, which is marked by overacting, exaggeration, lots of sighs, and yelling, clenched fists, heaving, shouting, you get the idea, swimming, and so on. And I'm sure we've seen lots of musical performances that fit this description, not to make any value judgments here, but maybe every fast passage is just aggressively fast, and the slow passages are all uniformly just incredibly gut-wrenching and exaggerated expressions on the face, and so on. Okay, so there can be a certain excitement in this, I think, but I think we'd all agree that high-tension performance loses its sheen pretty quickly. So, that's the far end of the negative side. At the far end of the positive side, we've got the goal, creative, truthful acting. And this is where the audience experiences, actually the actor and the audience experience a joining of the actor's emotions and the character's emotions. The actor does not pretend, but they actually become the character and experience what's happening at that moment. Such truthful performances, he says, create convincing and deeply moving art. Again, I think we've all experienced musical performances like this, too. Okay, so I think these two extremes are pretty obvious, pretty clear. But there's a category in the middle that's pretty intriguing, representation acting. So this, like the creative actor, the representation actor also feels the emotions of the character. But here's the difference. They feel those emotions only in rehearsal. Then what they do is they work to recreate that externally through a very highly polished and programmed pattern of acting. In fact, a lot of times a representation actor makes it a goal not to feel on stage because they think it's too dangerous. So they're just trying to rely on a very well-honed technique, and then they recreate externally what they've experienced in rehearsal. And I'm sure that a lot of really fine music performers do that. You can imagine going around the world. A lot of times you've got to just have it there and your technique is so solid. He makes the point that this type of art is less profound than it is beautiful because the really subtle, rich, emotional facets of a really top-notch performance, you're not subject to this kind of technique. And he also makes the point that the technique has to be almost 100% for this type of acting and delivery to remain art. Okay, so in reality, he emphasized that in a single performance, an actor might actually dip into 2 or even 3 of these styles along the continuum, because it could be that the cliche actor gets really caught up in the emotion of the moment, forgets him or herself, and just kind of gives into inspiration, and voila, something magical happens. Could be that a really wonderful, seasoned, truthful actor loses a little bit of focus, gets distracted for some time, and then they fall back on well-honed mechanical patterns, and that kind of carries them through until they can regain their mojo. So he wondered, how is it that a genius like Salvini can produce this consistently creative state of mind on stage night after night? And maybe he wondered, is there a way to create the conditions for an ordinary talent to be able to tap into that freedom and in order for inspiration to arise? So observing these great actors, especially Salvini, he discovered several principles of creative art, and these became the core elements of his method that I have listed on your handout there. Just before we move on to those, let's just do a quick recap. We've talked about 3 styles, actually. We've talked about the theatrical state of mind, which is the undesirable one, where the performer is very self-conscious and not behaving naturally. We talked about the inner creative state, where inspiration has a chance of flowing freely. We've talked about the 3 styles of acting, which kind of depend on which state of mind the performer feels in performance and in rehearsal. And I think it's a good idea to go home and ask yourself what kind of performer you aspire to be, and whether your rehearsal habits are creating the conditions for that to happen or not. And anyway, I think it's a pretty fascinating, for me it was one of the most revelatory discussions in Stanisklavski when I came across all this in my 20s. Okay, so now we're ready to start looking at the 8 core elements. And we're going to start with imagination. Because it's through imagination, Stanisklavski said, that the actor tackles the fundamental challenge of dramatic art. And what is that fundamental challenge? It's this: how do I transform the fiction of the play into artistic stage reality? Remember, the playwright and the composer supply a great deal, but the performer has to supply a lot more. They have to supply a subtext, and it's through imagination that subtext starts to become clear, and the musician is able to enter the emotional world of that piece of music. So Stanisklavski writes, if an actor utters a word or does something on the stage in a mechanical way without knowing who he is, where he comes from, why he is where he is, what he wants, where he will go to, and what he will do there, then he is acting without imagination. And that fraction of time he spends on the stage is not truthful. Likewise, if a musician plays or sings a phrase mechanically and without purpose, then that performance, at least that moment, is going to be great and hollow. So he believed that every performer's imagination can be awakened and cultivated through regular practice, and he had all kinds of exercises for that he led his actors through and talks about in An Actor Prepares. Very often they use improvisation, but they also use something he called the magic if. We're going to get to that in a few minutes. But he then recommended that all artists become very keen observers of people and of all the arts as a way to spark their imaginations. Now, imaginative thinking has to become second nature, but it has to be disciplined and channeled. He said, he was always scornful of intuition. And he said that, in other words, that an actor shouldn't feel free to just act any way they feel, no matter how strong their feelings are, because they have to, there's a responsibility to the play, just as we have a responsibility to the music. So for the audience to believe and be moved, the performer's actions must align with what he called the given circumstances of the play. And you can say exactly the same for music. By the way, did you get a handout when you came in?
I did.
Good, okay, great. So the second element, the given circumstances, of play would be everything that the playwright has given you, the characters, the setting, the plot, the dialogue, augmented by the actor's understanding of people in their world, their understanding of what the world was like or is like in a particular setting of that very specific play, and so on. So in music, what would the given circumstances look like? The specific melodies that were given, we play these notes, the harmonies, the rhythms, everything the composer provides, the expressive indications, augmented by our knowledge of the instrument, acoustics in the room, performance practice, all of these things. So the unique given circumstances of a work, of each piece, they bring discipline and focus to the musician's work. They provide parameters. Honoring the given circumstances helps the performer avoid something that Stanisklavski called and abhorred generic acting, or acting in general. And this is how he explains. He says, for most actors, any human passion, love, jealousy, hate, etc., is one big and generalized emotion. But this is not so. Every passion is a complex of things experienced emotionally. The sum total of a variety of different feelings, experiences, states. In love, there is often hatred and scorn. Don't mention that to my wife, and admiration, and indifference, and ecstasy, and embarrassment. The sun spectrum has only 7 colors, the scale only 7 notes. Yet the combination of these notes of music and these colors of painting are not to be numbered. The same must be said of our fundamental emotions. So, if we apply that to music, let's say that a passage is just marked ritardando and diminuendo. Okay, any competent player is going to be able to play slower and softer by rote. But the artist is going to go on to ask, why is the music doing that? Is that moment, actually, let me backtrack just a hair. Let's say that there's a passage that we decide is sad. Okay, a very big generalized emotion. So the artist is going to ask, though, is that sadness absolute, or maybe it's a bittersweet sadness? Is it maybe a sadness tinged with anger, or tinged with regret, or maybe tinged with confusion? Is the sadness a deep sadness or shallow? Is it secret or is it a public sadness? All of these different things are going to color the performance, how they feel and how they inflect. So just think about how emotionally rich and meaningful, really, music becomes when every moment, every emotion is motivated by this kind of very distinct and vivid emotion rather than something generic and vague like sadness. So understanding a play or a piece of music's given circumstances helps the performer play their character as an individual with a rich, multifaceted emotional inner life. And using the same principles, we can think of a piece of music having personality or multiple personalities. Okay, as promised, we're going to look at the magic if. So Stanisklavski repeatedly reminded us that dramatic art is based on action. And not just any kind of action, not action in general, but purposeful action, with each action driven by a specific inner motivation. And he called this principle, the first natural law of acting. On the stage, he writes, the actor must act both externally and internally. A stage action must be internally justified and logical. An actor must not pretend passions and characters. he must act under the influence of passions and in character. Then the actor and the audience believe. And metaphorically too, music is always, there's always action in music, because music is always doing something. It's always moving from one place to another, metaphorically, like a virtual space, and it's moving through time. And each of these moments really reveals that the music is a character that has wants and desires. How do we communicate these wants and desires? Through sound gestures. Okay, you can think of, here's a little example, modulating. So a modulation is moving from one place to another, from one key to another. And it's the performer's challenge to say, why is that happening in that particular way at this particular moment? So is the music, for example, mostly wanting to escape from something, or leave something, or wanting to embrace something else? Is the music moving to this new place out of fear, out of excitement? You know, is it moving tentatively or forcefully? Is it moving kind of secretly? You know, is it exhausted with this? And all of these things, again, it's going to color how that passage is reflected. So how does a performer discover what these inner motivations are? Well, this is where the magic if comes in. He says the word, this little word if, exerts a powerful power on the musician. And a performer will begin to create believable actions when we simply ask, or what would I do if certain circumstances were true? The question stimulates creative activity because it presents a compelling problem that the performer must solve. And by stimulating the imagination, the tiny word if acts as a lever to lift the performer into a world of creativity. How useful for teachers? Okay, this is where my example really should come in of the new guitar and the new window. So as I said, any competent player can do that without really thinking about it. But if there's some inner justification for it, then it's going to have a different color. So in short, if questions help the performer become invested in musical action, and he called the magic if the performer's best friend. It's one of the main tools, one of the main core elements. So let's get right to, again, one of the key elements, really key elements, analysis of a role, analysis of a piece of music. Because remember, the text is supplied by the playwright or the composer, but it's the actor or the musician who has to supply the subtext that's missing. And the performer discovers this subtext through analysis, which for Stanisklavski was never just an intellectual process, because the performer has to come to understand the flow of feelings in that work as well. So the purpose of analysis, and I'm going to translate this into music speak, is to search out creative stimuli to attract or excite the musician and help them identify with the musical character. The right kind of analysis deepens the soul of the music. Okay, you can imagine Stanisklavski-inspired analysis doesn't look very much like the kind of analysis we learn in our music theory classes, does it? He used terms, well, one way it starts out the same is we split up the work into shorter segments. He called these segments episodes, units, and beats. Analogies would be movements, sections of a piece, passages, phrases, even down to a motif, or even sometimes a single sound, because that can be a musical gesture, a musical action. So each of these segments, from the largest to the smallest, is a musical gesture that contains its own creative problem, its own inner motivation waiting to be discovered, its own objective, which is the seed of action. And he advised us to invent a name for each gesture that reveals its purpose. Because the right name crystallizes that unit's objective and exerts powerful fascination on the performer, on the creative will, and it makes them want to carry out that action. It really got a crystallized concept of what that is. And he says it helps to include a verb in the name, because what do verbs do? They apply action. And one of the most powerful verbs is want. I want to, whatever that is. He says that that word want inspires bursts of desire, which is the raw stuff of inner motivation. So a play or a piece of music as a whole contains one, we call it a super objective, which is the essential goal of the work as a whole. And in a convincing performance, all of the smaller segments or gestures, all of these objectives converge in a stream to carry out the super objective in what he called the through line of action. There has to be a logic and a continuity in the emotions and the external actions. Our art, Stanisklavski said, must have a whole unbroken line that flows from the past through the present and into the future. And if the performer breaks that through line, then the performance loses credibility at that moment. Okay, so I have a short example of this kind of analysis that's on the back of your handout. And I'm going to talk through it pretty quickly and then play the piece as a whole. And this is a pretty well-known piece. I wouldn't describe it to everybody. I hope everybody knows it. It's a piece that Straubing wrote when he was only 15 years old. Just an amazing piece. And Horowitz played it a lot. The etude, opus 2 etude in C# minor. And after working on this some years ago, I decided that for the super objective, this piece, this persona, this character, its main desire is, I want you to feel my grief. Okay, so I've got 4 excerpts from the piece that we'll look at. And the first one is, the first unit is the first 8 measures, which for me the subtext is, I want to tell you about my sorrow. Not quite as intense as, I want you to feel my grief. It's just kind of getting started. I want to tell you about my sorrow. And the first 2 measures, I want to tell you about my sorrow. The pain cuts like no other. I struggle to resist, but it's useless. The pain returns. And then at the very end of that, down the bass, there's this wonderful little tenor line, or baritone line, which I feel is a wry reflection that says, what a pathetic fool I am. So just to jog your memories of this piece, I'm going to play that much. So I want to tell you about my sorrow. It's this one. The pain cuts like no other. I struggle to resist. It's useless. The pain returns. Is this right? Okay, and then in the piece we have all that same material intensified a little bit. So let's jump up to the next segment I pulled out. Which goes to a major key, by the way, and I'm interpreting this as I yearn for happier times past. And to split it up a bit, I once was happy, I had faint memories of when I could feel tenderness. Faint memories. marked appropriately with triple P, which is just what an adolescent composer would want to do. All this that hangs. Now the next unit I pulled out comes several phrases later, where we hear exactly what I just played, but now in a lower minor key. So it's responding to the first one. And I interpreted it like this. For me, happiness was an illusion. That happiness was but an illusion, a cruel, unbearable illusion. Let me play that one more time because I've got to end the. A cruel, unbearable illusion. Okay, then it goes on to the last moments of the piece. Which is, I want to give up. And broken down into smaller gestures. Leave me, I want to sink down, down, into the pain. Nothing left, no life, no memories. And then the last measure, darkness. Nothing left. Okay, so now I'm going to play the whole piece. And if you want to kind of keep track on your handout of when these four specific episodes are through that, creative and not useless. But of course, my goal is to achieve a through line of action. And we'll see if I can do it. piece. But I think, if you realize that,
Oh, let there be light.
is that good?
And
Great.
Karen just saw that there was another light switch there. Oh,
Well, we needed it for this dark piece. We needed it. But, if you enter into, in this case, Scriabin's, as an actual person, I think in this case, his world, that was real. That was real. And so there's nothing maudlin about those emotions at all. I think it's genuine. Okay, so let's go on to the next element. And again, I'm not getting an advance. Emotion memory. So we're going to talk about emotions and emotion memory. For starters, we have to remember that the emotions are not in the play, they're not in the piece of music. The emotions are in the performer. That's where they come from. So he states that the soul of the character consists of the performer's own emotions, and performers must extract this emotional material from deep within themselves from their emotion memory. So let's see how he wanted us to think about emotion memory. He said, imagine a whole bunch of houses, and every house has a whole bunch of rooms, and every room has a lot of drawers and closets and so on, and every one of those drawers has a bunch of boxes, and inside all these boxes, a bunch of beads, and those are emotions. And he says it's very hard for a performer to always find one specific emotion. Some are easy to find, but some are very difficult, and he had lots of exercises for tapping into those. Our emotion memories are like these tiny beads. He says some are easy to find, others are not easily accessible. So he says when a tiny bead of emotion arises at an inspired moment in performance, the performer should rejoice and thank the muses, but it would be a mistake day after day for the performer to try to hunt down that same emotion again. Now, where are you going to find it? That exact same bead, that same emotional experience, because it's likely to prove elusive and irretrievably lost. In other words, we shouldn't obsess about recreating this or that feeling. It's impossible to force the reappearance of the feeling. It's better to achieve a new and fresh inspiration so that that same beat or another one will appear by itself. We must try to find what caused the feeling to arise in the first place. When the conditions are right, then new feelings will arise. To attempt to repeat a feeling is like trying to revive a faded flower. And he says, why not try to grow a new flower instead? Sure. Okay, core element number 6. He talked constantly about honesty and truth in performance. The truthful musical performance comes about only when the performer identifies with the feelings and delivers every musical gesture with conviction. And that's when the performance rings true. The performer believes in it, and so will the audience. To put it another way, and I love this quote, he says, the real actor says, I know that the scenery, makeup, costumes, and the fact that I have to perform my work in public is nothing but a barefaced lie. But I don't care, because if everything around me on the stage were true, and if I were actually that character, then I would behave in exactly that way. In this sense, my words and actions are truthful. So when an actor feels an appropriate internal motivation to act, then they're going to reach joyfully for the playwrights, those words and notes. Now, he cautioned that a performer's understanding and belief rarely come about all at once with a large work. And he says, if an actor finds it difficult to grasp at once the large truth of some big action, then he should divide it up into smaller pieces and and try to believe in the smallest of them. And quite often then, by realizing one little truth, it develops this, by developing one moment of belief in that part, you're going to gain an insight into the whole. And I'll tell you, this is exactly my experience when I learned a piece of music. I'm not going to have the same strong identification with every moment, but if there's something where I really connect with that and go there first, you maybe learn that first, then it actually a seed that expands out. And a lot of times, maybe more and more, I encourage my students to work that way too, rather than just say, you need to learn the more technical passages first. That's kind of how it's so hard. But if you can help them develop an emotional connection with the piece, that can help see them through later struggles in the learning process. Okay, communication with the audience was of paramount importance to Stanisklavski, of course. And he spoke of thought transmission and ray absorption and ray emission and grip, which are terms that after a century sound a little quaint, but the concepts hold very, very true. So maybe paradoxically, he discovered that communication gets short-circuited when the performer tries to communicate directly with the audience. So he said, forget about the audience. Better to communicate indirectly by cultivating our own inner feelings. And that way, he says, it is as though the inner feelings and desires emit rays that issue through the eyes and body and pour in a stream over other people. It's kind of interesting if you read Arthur Rubinstein's My Young Years, he talks about exactly that, the same way. Of course, forgetting about the audience requires very well-trained powers of attention, like you find only the best performers, actors like Salvini. But he noticed that Salvini always seemed intensely interested in what was happening on his side of the footlights, not on the audience's side of the footlights. And he writes, it was precisely this attention of Salvini's, concentrated on one point, that aroused my curiosity and forced me to take an interest in his life on the stage, to find out what it was that interested him so much. At that moment, he writes, I realized that the more an actor tries to entertain the spectator, the more the spectator will sit back like a lord and wait to be entertained without making the slightest effort to take part in the creative work that is taking place before them. But as soon as the actor stops paying attention to him, the spectator will begin to show an interest in the act. Now, you realize that even the best performers can sometimes be distracted from what they're doing. The real world intervenes. Yeah, what am I going to have for dinner after this? Tex-Mex. But in An Actor Who Cares, he describes a really wonderful exercise he did with his acting students. So he directed the spotlight, shine on the stage a real large circle, and he had the actors step inside it. And said, now your goal is to just pay attention to only what's happening within this circle, and the objects, the people, and so on. And then he started making the circle smaller and smaller, and what do you think happened to their focus? It got more intense, it intensified. And everything in that circle got more and more vivid. He called this, or his theory of the circle of attention. So for musicians, how would we put that into practice? It means that whatever is happening in our circle, in our imaginary circle, has to be the most compelling, fascinating thing in the universe. And of course, we're talking about the sounds we're creating. If you can find that kind of focus in the sounds you're creating at that exact second, and that's just the most compelling thing out there, it helps you stay focused. And then you achieve a state he called public solitude, which I just think is such a beautiful image. Okay, the last element, muscular tension. So he noted that fine performers move naturally on stage, even in moments of high intensity. They have a lot of physical freedom, which is critical because excess physical tension blocks the performer's emotions and kind of short circuits feeling, physical strain, short circuits feeling. And he pointed out that on the stage, the shortcomings that pass unnoticed in everyday life become unbearable in the strong light of the stage. For in the theater, human life is seen as if through binoculars, examined as through a magnifying glass. Now, he readily acknowledged that every performer, even the best, will almost always suffer some kind of nervous strain during public performance. So they have to remain vigilant. And in their rehearsals, they have to cultivate what he called an observer, a kind of special observer, to monitor your body and make sure, especially in the moments of highest intensity, that you're releasing this excess physical strain to the point that it becomes automatic. Okay, so that's the 8 core elements. And so to just wrap up, I hope something I said at the very beginning is a little more clear now. That Stanisklavski designed his system to draw out the actor's subconscious powers of expression, that's one part, in ways appropriate to the work. And if we translate that to music speak, he offered techniques for musicians that train the musician and also techniques for analyzing music. So the musician undertakes inner work on him or herself to cultivate a creative state of mind so that inspiration will descend more easily. And then they undertake inner analytical work on the music to explore the unique emotional essence of that piece and every gesture within it. And if you feel inspired to pick up your own copy of An Actor Prepares Now, then today will be a success. I don't know how our time is doing because I know we got kind of a late start, but I wonder if there are any questions or thoughts about all this.
Plenty of time for questions.
Oh yeah? Does it resonate?
So, do you think that we, when we're teaching young students, sometimes, I have so many friends that talk about stories that go along with pieces, and I say, oh, I don't do stories, but I should.
I'm kind of for it. And it's hard for me to, that's not my natural way of thinking. It really isn't, but yeah. Even a composer like Beethoven, that we think of as such an absolute composer, but there are hints in his writings and conversation books and so on that he always had something extra musical in mind. He just never shared it. But there was something always. And well, it's such a long topic. I think that anything, like about this theory of, fractal theory, where no matter what scale you're looking at with something, the essential elements of that thing are present, no matter what scale you're looking at. Isn't that fractal theory? Okay, I think that with Stanisklavski, these principles are so fundamental that they can apply, if you express them simply, to a 6-year-old, as well as they can to an 80-year-old artist.
I'll chime in on that too. I think working with younger students and introducing them to this type of creative thinking can be really helpful, because I notice in some older students, it's more difficult for many older students that haven't had practice just communicating about music and emotion and their musical experience of a performance of a piece that they're working on, that they tend to have a lot of difficulty because they haven't practiced it so much. So I really appreciate the inspiration and to incorporate that more and help students build an emotional vocabulary that they can use to not only enrich their own performance, but also their own experience of music.
I personally find the struggle to put down in words, to crystallize in that way, the process of getting there is the value.
Mm-hmm.
And isn't this idea that when you play music, it's supposed to come from here out? I mean, that's what everybody thinks. Why do you play music? Oh, it's self-expression or whatever it is. You don't say, well, why do you play music? Oh, it's so I can play my 16ths, you know, or so I can balance the melody and accompaniment. No, it's to express something. And if that is just kind of totally woven in to teaching from day one, first lesson, then it just becomes natural and automatic. And there's a freedom. You know, to me, the difference between the theatrical state of mind, which I was in a lot in my younger years, and I'm talking about 20s and even 30s, and a little less in 40s, and a lot less in my 50s and now 60s. The idea of approaching a performance as a representation actor, where you've got all it down, and then you've drilled your nuances, and you've got you can recreate all that even if you're just that's one way of doing it. But if you go out there thinking, my goal is it's going to be different every time. I'm going to react. If some note comes out too loud, then I just adjust. If I start something a little too fast, it's okay. I just kind of either go, you know, the idea that the performance is going to be different every time, and my goal is to be there at the moment and respond to it, is so liberating. It's just an amazing goal to have.
It's hard to do with students.
It is, of course it is. But again, I mean, I think it's possible. How successful have I been in my career? Not very proud, but I have to think it's possible to create the conditions and lessons for that kind of attitude.
Yeah. It's just great.
You know, we work so much on musicality.
Yeah.
Kind of like feeding them like, you should crescendo here, and then
Right.
you can take extra time here, and it's basically like we're giving them our roadmap.
Right.
But if we're taking that and then adding this approach to it, it's like the emotions are feeding that more than me just being like, you should do this, and then you'll play musically. You know what I mean? It develops it more.
Yeah.
From them.
Yeah, it can take more time.
Yeah, helping them find that.
Right. But you know, that magic if, maybe your agenda is, God, I want to get the student to make that crescendo. God, how would you do this if if you suddenly came out of the woods and there was this beautiful view? How would you play that? And then if maybe they'll do it.
I think that would help fuel their
Yeah.
musicality and their expression, and you
Yeah.
don't have to just program it all.
Right.
Like that. That's a good approach.
You know, like he advised actors not to practice in front of the mirror. Because he said you're just practicing your external motions, that's mechanical acting. But if you feel it, then it's going to come out. Theoretically. You know, the improvisational aspect, remember I mentioned sparking imagination. I don't know that it necessarily like I hear improvisation and I'm thinking jazz, different notes and all this, but that's not my thing. I don't have that gift. I've never cultivated it. But, I can take a phrase and spend 30 minutes playing that one phrase over and over, experimenting, improvising with different ways of doing it. I think we do that a lot. So that's kind of an improvisational aspect.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's give a big round of applause. Thank you so much for this beautiful presentation.